So for today's video I'm going to show you how to make straps. These are really useful as things like bag handles, or you can use them as straps on clothing, that kind of thing. So I've cut a long piece of fabric that's as long as the strap that I want, plus about 5 centimeters on each side, and then I'm made it 4 times wider than I want my strap to be. So I want my strap to be 2.5 centimeters, so I've cut this width 10 centimeters. Like that. So I've brought my fabric over to the ironing board because if you've got an iron at this point, it's easier to get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold our fabric from the outside into the centre, and you can use your fingers to give it a little bit of a press in place, and then we'll fold from the top side down to the centre as well. So yes, so you can use your fingers to press and hold it into place, but if you've got an iron, then that will do the job for you very nicely. And I'm going to work my way down the strip of fabric, all the way down, folding until the fabric meets in the centre. So now my fabric is pressed, and I'm just going to fold it in half, and I want the edges to meet, so I'm trying really carefully to match up those edges. And again, if you have an iron, then you can use the iron to press that in place. If you don't, you can use your thumbnail like this, press it with your fingers, and then because I've ironed mine, it's staying fairly close to its shape. But if you don't have an iron, you might want to pin it. So just putting in a couple of pins every 10 centimeters or so. Will help you keep your edges together like this. So now we've folded our fabric and we've pressed it into shape. Now we can take this over to the machine, and we want to sew really close to this open edge. So we want to sew maybe 3 or 4 millimeters away from this edge. So this is going to be a real test of your straight sewing. So if you haven't practiced very much, you might want to get a scrap piece of fabric and just test sewing really close to an edge and try and get a really nice straight line. So I've brought my strap over to my machine and I'm placing it under the foot, and my foot has a little mark right in the middle there, and if I keep the edge of that strip of fabric up against that mark, then I'll get a nice straight stitch that's an equal distance away from this edge. Now I'm not going to sew backwards and forwards at the beginning and end of this lot of stitching, because when you make a strap you usually hide the raw ends or trim them off, or they'll be enclosed in a seam or something like that. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But we don't need to worry too much about reinforcing the beginning and end of the strap, because that's all going to be hidden away. So I'm just doing a very simple straight stitch, and I'm just using my hand to make sure that the strap goes through the machine nice and straight. I'm not really putting any pressure on it. I'm allowing the machine to feed it through. All I'm doing is using my hand to guide it. And because this is really small, I'm going to be really extra careful to keep my finger away from the needle. And I just keep stitching until I've got all the way to the end. If I feel that my stitching line is going off either to the left or to the right at any point, I just stop. I can always lift the foot, and if the needle's in there, I can pivot the fabric any way I like, put it down again, and then just start stitching again. It can be really tempting to try and go faster or to try and put it right while you're still stitching, but it's much easier if you stop, give yourself a breather, and then start again. And if you've put pins in your strap, just stop before you get to it. Take it out, make sure everything's nice and straight, and then keep sewing. So there's our finished stitch, and you want to check both sides of it just to make sure that you've caught your fabric in all the way on both sides. Sometimes those edges can drift apart just a little way. So what do you do with your strap once you've sewn it? Well, you usually want to attach it to another piece of fabric. So I've got a piece of fabric here, which is the one that I sewed a hen onto on our previous exercise. And I'm going to attach the strap so it looks like it's coming out of the top here. So this is what you do if you had a bag that you wanted to attach a bag strap onto. So I'm going to turn this over. So I take the end and I flip it over just about 1 centimetre, and that will hide all of that raw edge of the fabric. I place it where I want it, and I want to give it a good distance to be able to sew it on nice and tight. So I'm placing this about 4 centimetres below the top of the seam. I'm going to take a pin, and first I'm going to pin through all the layers, making sure that I've got that fold nicely in place. And then because this can move around a little bit, I'm going to put another pin in at the top here, and that will keep everything nice and square. So now I'm going to take this over to our sewing machine, and I'm going to sew a little rectangle. So I'm going to start up here. I'm going to catch the top seam in, so I'm going to start just a little way below this top seam. I'm going to sew down, and we're going to turn, sew along the bottom, turn, sew along the other side, and then turn again and close up our little rectangle. That'll mean that when we've got a strap on our bag or on our clothes, it's really, really robust and it's not going to pull off. Yeah, those are going to be really nice strong joins. So I'm going to place our fabric where I want it, and when I'm relatively happy that the needle would be going down through all of the layers of fabric there, I'm going to lower the foot. And then I'm going to sew backwards and forwards a couple of times to reinforce it. And then I'm going to sew all the way down to here. And when we get to here, we're going to do a 90-degree turn, and I'll show you how to do that. So first of all, the ends of these pins might get a little bit in the way. So now that the foot's down, this is holding our fabric nice and firm. So I'm just going to pull this one out just a little way, just to be sure that the end of the pin isn't going to be in the way of the needle. And again, I'm just going to pull that pin out just a little way. And now I'm as far into the corner as I want to be. So now I make sure that the needle is down. So the needle is going all the way through the fabric and into the bottom of the machine. That allows me to lift the foot and then swivel the fabric as much as I want. So now I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. I'm going to arrange the fabric because sometimes these little bits can stick out a bit, so I'm just going to make sure that they're nicely tucked under. I can put the foot down again, and then I can sew down to this corner here. And then again, I can lift the foot, turn the fabric, and now I can take this pin out as well. I can sew all the way to the top, maybe one more, and turn and sew back to join up with this edge of this rectangle here. One more, and then I'm going to sew backwards and forwards a couple of times. And that's it. So normally you'd do this in a colour of thread that wouldn't stand out, but I wanted you to be able to see what was going on today, so I have done it in a colour of thread that is going to be really obvious. And when I turn it over, you should see a nice neat rectangle on the other side. Now I know I've got a few stray threads here, but that's okay, I'm just going to clip them off. So now we've got a strap that's attached to our fabric in a really firm and secure way. Another way of securing a strap is to sew it straight into a seam. So if you had a look at our sewing seams tutorial, you'll know that you take two pieces of fabric, you flip one over, and then you sew them together. If you want to insert a strap into your fabric at any point, you just line it up, and a pin in it far enough away from the seam line is going to keep it in place. Then you can sew the two pieces of fabric together just as you normally would, and your strap will seem to disappear into the seam. So I'm going to sew along here at 1.5 centimetres away from the edge. So then this is how that looks. And you can take your pin out, and then you can choose to press your seam closed like this, or you may want it open for some reason. So if you were doing like a strap in the back of a waistcoat or something like that, that's how you'd attach that. So making your strap, you ended up with two raw ends where you could see the edge of the fabric. And you may not want that, you may want something that's a bit more like a tab. So one end is going to be enclosed. So this is how we make that. So I've got two pieces of fabric and they're identical. So I've cut a little 45-degree angle into the top of each. So my little tab is going to have a little point at the end of it. So I'm going to sandwich these together. Put a couple of pins in to hold them in place. And then I'm going to sew all the way around the outside. So I'm going to sew down here. When I get to this point, I'm going to pivot it and I'm going to sew along here. Again, I'm going to get to this point, I'm going to pivot it 90 degrees and sew it down here. Pivot again and sew all the way back to the top. This time I am going to reinforce the stitches at the top and the bottom. And the reason is that I'm going to turn this inside out, and when I do, I'm going to put a fair bit of pressure on these stitches here, so I'm going to make sure they're really strong. So I'm going to sew 1.5 centimeters away from the edge of the fabric again. If you wanted to, you could do a smaller seam allowance on here because we're going to trim it. So now I've made sure my needle's down. I'm going to lift the foot, turn the fabric, put the needle down again and keep sewing. And again. And I think I'm going to do one more. So then I've got a line of stitching in a nice neat shape with a little point on the end. Now I want to turn this inside out, but at the minute I've got far too much excess fabric on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut it really quite close to the stitching line. So I'm going to cut to about 0.5 centimetre away from the stitching all the way round, and that will take away a lot of the bulk that will help it to lie flat when I've turned it inside out. And then when you turn it inside out, the corners here can get really bulky and they can look a little puckered, because you've got so much fabric trying to fit into a tiny little space. So it's a good idea to chop off the corners. You want to be really careful not to chop into your stitches. You want to make sure there's a good 3 or 4, maybe even 5 threads away from your line of stitching. So I'm going to do that on these corners as well. And that will help the whole thing lie really nice and flat when I turn it inside out. Turning it through can be a little fiddly, but it's good just to be patient. And it is just like turning a pair of socks inside out. It's just a little smaller. So if you can get your finger in there, you can use that. You want something blunt. You don't want to be poking anything too sharp in there, otherwise you can go straight through your fabric. Like the blunt end of a pencil or something like that works really well. And then you can use your fingers to prise apart these bits at the end and just slowly pull the whole thing through. I have a little tool here that I use just for this. It's got a point on the end, but it's not too sharp. There we go. We're all the way through now. So now I'm going to just spend a little while poking out those corners. So again, if you've got a pencil or something like that, that works really well for this. You can use your scissors, but make sure you don't use them open. So you can take a pair of scissors like this and use them in the corner, but be very careful because a sharp pair of scissors with a pointy end could go right through the fabric. This one's nice and dull, and I wouldn't do it with the scissors open. So once I'm happy with my little tab, you can see it's a little wrinkly, so I can pull it and stretch it and get it to lie flat, or I can take it over to my iron and give it a little press. So here are our straps and 2 different ways of attaching them, and then this is our tab. And we're going to be using these methods when we come to make our bag with the final exercise this week. So in the next video I'm going to be talking a little bit about sewing on buttons and making buttonholes, and I'm going to be showing you how to make a buttonhole in this tab that we can use to fold and fasten our bag. So thanks very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed that. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more content like this, then please do subscribe. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye!